The snow outside Malmedy was already going gray with cold when the first shell landed, and by the time the sun should have been up, the road was full of German steel. He was 19. He had a folding cot's worth of combat experience and no winter coat. Somebody higher up had decided tanks couldn't move through this ground, that the worst you'd see was a few German infantry feeling their way through the fog. So the men on that strong point dug in and waited for a handful of foot soldiers. At around 4 in the morning, the tanks came, bumper to bumper. Engines you could feel in your chest before you could see them, and this kid from a farm in upstate New York, a replacement nobody had heard of, did not run. He did something that day that made hardened SS crews back their tanks up and pull away from a bridge they had every reason to take. Not because he had more men. He didn't have men at all, not really. He had a bazooka with no rockets, a rifle, and a stubbornness that read, from the other side of the smoke, like an entire company. His name was Francis Sherman Currey. Most people have never heard it. The Germans who met him at Malmedy never forgot it. Here's why he might be the scariest soldier the Second World War ever produced. To understand what happened on that bridge, you have to understand what December 1944 actually felt like, because on paper the war in Europe was almost finished. France was free. The Allies had pushed the Germans back to their own border, and everyone from the generals down to the mail clerks assumed the whole thing would be wrapped up by spring. Soldiers talked about being home for the next Christmas. Some of them were already writing letters saying so. Hitler had one card left, and he played it in the worst possible weather at the worst possible time for the men who'd have to absorb it. The plan was audacious to the point of being reckless. Punch a hole through the thinnest part of the American line in the Ardennes forest, drive fast for the Belgian port of Antwerp, split the British and American armies apart, and force the Western Allies to the negotiating table before the Russians finished the job in the East. It was a gamble built on speed and surprise, and for the first few days it worked terrifyingly well. The Ardennes was supposed to be the quiet sector. It was where you sent green units to get their feet wet, and where you sent chewed-up units to rest. Thick forest, steep ground, narrow icy roads. The American command genuinely believed no serious armored attack could come through it, which is exactly why the Germans chose it. On the 16th of December, more than 200,000 German troops and something close to 1,000 tanks and assault guns came out of that forest at once. The men in front of them were outnumbered, spread thin, and in a lot of places had no idea what was coming until it was already on top of them. Fog and low cloud sat over everything, and that was no small thing. The one advantage the Americans had leaned on all through the campaign was air power. Fighter bombers could break up an armored column before it ever reached the front. But you can't fly what you can't see, and for days the planes stayed grounded. The men on the ground were on their own, and they were freezing. This gets lost sometimes, buried under the tank charts and the arrows on the maps, but the cold that December was a weapon in its own right. Temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. Snow filled the foxholes. Men who couldn't feel their feet made bad decisions about when to move and when to stay. Rifles jammed. Frostbite pulled as many soldiers off the line as bullets did in some units. If you've never tried to think straight while genuinely, dangerously cold, it's hard to describe what it does to you. It slows everything down. It makes the simplest task feel enormous. The men holding those road junctions weren't just outnumbered and outgunned. They were exhausted and half frozen on top of it, which makes what a few of them managed to do out there even harder to fathom. The first days were pure confusion. Units got cut off from each other and from headquarters. Communication lines were shelled or overrun. Reports came in that made no sense, or contradicted each other, or turned out to be German troops in captured American uniforms sowing exactly that kind of chaos. Some men, faced with tanks and no way to stop them, pulled back or scattered. Others dug in where they stood, understanding that no reinforcements were coming in time, and that the only thing between the enemy and a clean breakthrough was them. It was in that fog of not knowing, where a single stubborn position could matter out of all proportion to its size, that the whole thing was decided. The battle that followed got a name that stuck because of the shape it made on the maps. The German advance bulged into the Allied line like a fist pushed into a curtain, so the papers back home started calling it the Battle of the Bulge. It became the largest single battle the United States Army fought in the entire war, and the bloodiest. Tens of thousands of Americans were killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of weeks, a lot of them in the first few chaotic days when nobody had a clear picture of anything. At the very tip of the German spear was a unit that deserves its own dark chapter. The 1st SS Panzer Division led the drive, and the men out front belonged to a battle group under an officer named Joachim Peiper. These were not ordinary soldiers, and they did not fight by ordinary rules. They'd earned their reputation on the Eastern Front, where they'd left a trail of burned villages behind them, and a nickname that told you everything you needed to know about how they operated. They came into Belgium carrying that same appetite for cruelty, and within a day of the offensive kicking off, they showed the Americans exactly what kind of enemy had arrived. On the 17th of December, near a crossroads outside Malmedy, a column of Peiper's men captured a group of American soldiers from an artillery observation battalion. The Americans had surrendered. They were unarmed, hands up, no longer a threat to anyone. The SS herded them into an open field and opened fire. Somewhere around 84 men were shot down where they stood. A handful survived by dropping and lying still under the bodies of their friends, waiting for the Germans to move on, then crawling for the American lines to tell what they'd seen. Word of that field spread faster than any order ever could. Every American in the sector learned within a day or two that surrendering to these particular Germans was not a way to stay alive. And that changed something. It hardened men who might otherwise have thrown in the towel when the tanks came. If the choice was fighting or being marched into a field and gunned down, a lot of them decided they would rather fight. The massacre was meant to spread terror. In some places it did the opposite. It gave frightened, freezing men a very simple reason to hold their ground. That was the world Francis Currey was standing in on the 21st of December. Cut-off units, overrun gun positions, radios that couldn't reach anyone, tanks coming out of the fog with no air support to stop them, and behind those tanks, the men who'd already proven they took no prisoners. Into that, one teenaged rifleman from Sullivan County was about to have the worst and most important morning of his life. So who was he, before Malmedy turned his name into something the enemy whispered? He was, by almost any measure, a nobody. That's not an insult. It's the whole point. Francis Sherman Currey was born on the 29th of June 1925 in Loch Sheldrake, a small place in the Catskills of New York where nothing much was expected to happen. His childhood came apart early. Both of his parents were gone by the time he was 12, and he was taken in by a foster family who raised him on a farm near a little town called Hurleyville. So he grew up doing chores before school, hands already used to work, no cushion under him, no family name opening any doors. If you were building the profile of a future war hero, you would not start here. He finished at Hurleyville High School, and 1 week later, at 17 years old, he walked into a recruiting office and joined the Army. There was no grand speech behind it. It was 1943, the country was at war, and joining up was simply what young men did. He wasn't chasing medals. He didn't seem to be chasing anything except the ordinary sense that this was his to do. Here's a detail that says a lot about him, and that most tellings of his story skip right over. The Army actually thought enough of Currey to send him to officer candidate school, and he completed it when he was still only 18. He earned the right to a commission. And then his superiors turned him down for it, on the grounds that he was, in their word, too immature to lead men as an officer. Sit with that for a second. The same young man they judged too green to wear a lieutenant's bars would, inside of a year, do something no lieutenant in the division did. The Army's paperwork had him figured all wrong. Malmedy would settle the argument. He came ashore at Omaha Beach in July of 1944, a few weeks after the D-Day landings, when the beach was no longer a killing ground, but the country beyond it very much still was. That autumn he got funneled into the replacement system, which was its own kind of grim. Replacements were the men shipped forward to fill the gaps left by the dead and wounded in veteran units. They arrived alone, often at night, into companies where everyone already knew everyone, and nobody was in a hurry to learn the new guy's name, because the new guy had a bad habit of not lasting long. On the 18th of October, Currey was assigned as one of those replacements to the 3rd Platoon of K Company, part of the 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division. He was sent forward without proper winter gear, which is why he'd later deal with frostbite on top of everything else. The division he'd joined was no soft outfit. The 30th went by the nickname Old Hickory, and it had been in some of the ugliest fighting since Normandy. These were men who had bled through the hedgerows and beaten back German counterattacks in the summer, and had the kind of hard, quiet competence that only comes from surviving things. There's a story that German intelligence rated the 30th as one of the toughest American divisions they'd run into, the kind of unit that showed up wherever a line needed to be held and simply refused to break. Dropping a 19-year-old replacement into that company was like putting a rookie into a locker room full of veterans who'd stopped counting their scars. He could have drowned in it, and plenty of replacements did, in every sense. The replacement system was one of the war's quiet cruelties. You'd train stateside, ship over, and then get parceled out one or two at a time into a company that had just lost people, so the veterans had a grim, self-protective habit of not getting attached. Nobody learned your name for a while, because the odds said you might not be around long enough to make it worth the trouble. You had no friends, no history with the men beside you, and you were expected to figure out combat in real time, at the worst possible moment, with everyone assuming the worst about how you'd hold up. It's a lonely, frightening way to enter a war. A lot of good men were killed in their first days simply because they were new and didn't yet know the 100 small things that keep you alive. He didn't. He saw his first real combat that same October, and the men around him started to notice something. He didn't rattle. He listened. He learned fast, especially about weapons, and he retained the technical details that a lot of soldiers let slide. How exactly a bazooka behaved, where a tank was vulnerable and where it wasn't. How to keep a machine gun feeding under stress. Small things, until the morning they became everything. Within 6 weeks of arriving as a scared replacement, Currey had been made a sergeant and was leading part of that same platoon. The kid the officer board thought was too immature was already being trusted with other men's lives. Nothing about him looked the part. He wasn't big. He wasn't loud. He didn't give speeches or strut around. If you'd pointed at him in the 3rd week of December 1944 and said that man is about to become one of the most feared soldiers in Europe, the people who knew him would have laughed, and then they'd have gone back to trying to stay warm. He was just another name on the roster of a unit about to get hit by the full weight of a German offensive. By the 20th of December, that offensive had chewed miles into the Allied line, and Malmedy had become a place that mattered. It sat near a set of road junctions, and in a fast-moving armored battle, roads are the whole game. Tanks need them. Supply trucks need them. Whoever held the crossings around Malmedy controlled which way the war in that corner of Belgium was going to flow. If the Germans took them, they got a clean run deeper into the American rear. If the Americans held, the whole German timetable, already slipping, slipped further. The 30th Division drew the job of holding the ground, and one of the positions that had to be held was a strong point guarding a bridge and a river crossing on the edge of town. Lose that, and you handed German armor a paved invitation. Currey's squad was among the men posted there. It was brutally cold, the roads slick with ice, fog sitting low enough to swallow a tank at 50 yards. Everyone on that line understood two things. First, if the Germans came, there'd be almost no warning. Second, after what had happened in that field a few days earlier, being captured wasn't a soft landing. So they stayed, and they watched the fog, and they waited. The waiting ended in the dark hours of the 21st. It started, the way these things did, with artillery. The German guns opened up and hammered the American positions, throwing up snow and dirt and noise, and Currey, who'd already learned to read a battlefield, understood immediately what a barrage like that usually meant. You don't shell an empty road for fun, You shell it to keep the defenders' heads down while you bring up something heavier. He was right. As the smoke thinned, he looked down the road and saw the barrel of a German tank easing around a corner. Then another behind it. Then the shapes of infantry moving up in support. This wasn't a probe. This was a coordinated push by exactly the kind of unit that had been running roughshod over everyone in its path, and it landed right on the strong point Curry's platoon was holding. There's a particular kind of fear that comes with hearing tanks before you see them. The ground carries the sound. You feel the vibration through the frozen dirt in your chest and your teeth before the shape ever resolves out of the fog, and by then it's close. For infantry with no armor of their own, a tank isn't just a bigger enemy. It's a different category of problem. Your rifle does nothing to it. Your machine gun does nothing to it. It can sit at a distance you can't answer and grind your position into the snow, while its coaxial gun cuts down anyone who moves. The proper counters, the tank destroyers, and the anti-tank guns were the reason the strong point had been considered defensible at all. And in the first minutes of the attack, those were the very things the German tanks rolled over and silenced. So the situation Curry found himself in wasn't just bad. It was the specific nightmare every infantryman is trained to dread: armor in the open and nothing left to stop it. The first thing that happened is the thing most accounts of this day gloss over, because it doesn't fit the tidy hero story. Curry's side started losing. The German tanks rolled over the American tank destroyers and anti-tank guns positioned near the strong point, the very weapons that were supposed to stop armor, and knock them out or force them silent. The defense that was meant to hold the line came apart. The platoon had no choice but to fall back, and they pulled into a nearby factory building for whatever cover its walls could give them. So picture the actual situation. A young sergeant and a small group of men, pushed out of their prepared positions, holed up in a factory, with German tanks in the street outside, and SS infantry setting up in a house just down the way. By any honest read of the tactical picture, it was over. They'd been beaten off their ground. That's the moment Curry decided the math didn't apply to him. Inside the factory, he found a bazooka that some withdrawing American unit had left behind. A real chance, except for one problem that would have ended most men's initiative right there. There were no rockets for it. An empty tube is a metal stick. And the rockets, when he spotted them, were across the street, sitting on an abandoned half-track that was fully exposed to the German tanks and to the infantry in that house. To get ammunition for the one weapon that could kill a tank, he'd have to cross open ground under fire from those very tanks. He crossed it. He ran into the street with small arms rounds and machine gun fire and tank fire chewing up the ground around him, reached the half-track, grabbed rockets, and made it back to a firing position. He wasn't the only one working the weapon. He had a companion helping him, and it took both of them, but Curry was the one who lined up the shot. He fired once. The rocket hit the exact seam where the tank's turret met the hull, the weak point he'd have known about from all that weapon study nobody else bothered to memorize, and the tank was finished with a single round. One shot. One tank. From a man who, 20 minutes earlier, had been on the losing end of this fight, and he was just getting warmed up. Moving to a new spot because staying still gets you killed, he caught sight of 3 German soldiers standing in the doorway of a house the enemy had occupied. He brought his automatic rifle up and dropped all 3 before they'd fully registered him. Then he did something that reads as either insane or ice-cold depending on your temperament. He came out of cover and pushed forward, alone, closing to within about 50 yards of that enemy-held house, close enough to reach it with a rocket. With friendly fire covering him, he stood straight up in the open and fired, and the round tore down half of one wall of the house. Stand up, in the open, 50 yards from a house full of SS, and fire a bazooka at it. That's not a figure of speech. That's what the record says he did. It was from that forward, exposed position that he saw them. 5 American soldiers, pinned down and unable to move, trapped for hours by the guns in that house and by 3 tanks covering the ground. They were stuck. They couldn't crawl out, couldn't run, couldn't do anything but keep their heads down and hope. And Curry understood, coldly and correctly, that those men were going to stay trapped until the tanks and the guns were dealt with. So he went and dealt with them. He crossed back to a vehicle and came away with an armful of anti-tank grenades. Then, still under heavy fire, he started launching them, and this is where the fight tipped over into something the Germans genuinely could not account for. The grenades drove the tank crews out of their vehicles and into the house for cover. Think about what that means. Men in tanks, inside armor, abandoning that armor because the fire coming at them made staying inside feel like the more dangerous option. Currey had turned their own protection into a trap. Then he climbed onto a half-track, in full view of the Germans, put his hands on its mounted machine gun, and opened up on the house where the tank crews and infantry were now bunched together. When that position got too hot, or that gun gave out, he shifted again and manned a second machine gun, whose crew had already been killed. And under the covering fire he was throwing out, the 5 pinned-down men who'd been stuck for hours finally got up and got clear. All 5 of them made it back. Added up, over the course of that morning, one man knocked out a tank, killed or scattered infantry, blew apart a chunk of a fortified house, drove 4 separate tank crews to abandon their vehicles, worked at least 3 different weapons at 3 different positions, and pulled 5 trapped Americans out of a spot that should have been their grave. Deprived of their armor and taking heavy losses among their infantry, the Germans facing that strongpoint did the thing SS troops almost never did on their winning drive through the Ardennes. They withdrew. They gave up the ground. Here's what I keep turning over about that day, and it's the thing that separates Currey from the usual reckless brave guy story. None of what he did was blind. He wasn't a man who lost his mind and charged. Every move was a decision. Get the rockets, kill the tank at the seam, reposition, drop the men in the doorway, push to 50 yards, take down the wall, drive the crews out with grenades, man the gun, cover the escape. It reads like a checklist executed under fire by someone whose hands weren't shaking. The Germans weren't beaten by fury. They were beaten by a 19-year-old thinking faster and more clearly than they were, while standing up in the open, while everyone around him was pinned to the dirt. And that's the real answer to the question in the title. Why was he the scariest soldier of that war? Not because he was the angriest or the strongest or the most bloodthirsty, because from the other side of the smoke, he didn't behave like one man. And one man behaving like that makes no sense, and soldiers are most afraid of what they can't explain. Put yourself in the boots of an SS tank commander that morning. You've had a good few days. You've rolled over gun positions, pushed a platoon out of its strong point, herded it into a factory. You're winning. And then, from a defense you thought you'd broken, the fire starts coming from everywhere. A bazooka round from one window kills a tank. Rifle fire from a doorway drops your men. A figure stands up in the open street, which no sane soldier does, and blows a wall out of your strong point. Grenades start driving your crews out of their tanks. A machine gun opens up from a wrecked half-track, then a different machine gun opens up from somewhere else. How many Americans are you facing? You genuinely can't tell. 10? 20? A whole company you didn't know was there? Because no single man does all of that at once. That was the illusion, and Currey didn't set out to create it. It came from the pace and the unpredictability. He moved between positions so fast and hit from so many angles with so many different weapons that the volume and variety of it painted a picture of numbers that weren't there. The enemy started reacting to a force that existed only in the speed of one exhausted teenager. And a force you can't count is a force you can't plan against. Hesitation crept into an attack that had known nothing but momentum, and in a fast armored assault, hesitation is fatal. The clock the Germans were racing kept ticking while they stalled in front of a bridge held, as far as they could tell, by a ghost. Notice too how many different jobs he did in that short window, because that's the part that would have really rattled the men across the street. On a battlefield, roles are usually separate. There's the anti-tank guy with the bazooka. There's the machine gunner. There's the rifleman. There's the medic who pulls the wounded out. Those are different men doing different things, usually working together as a team, and an enemy learns to read a defense by the shape of it, where the machine gun sits, where the anti-tank threat is, where the riflemen are dug in. Currey was all of those men at once. He was the anti-tank threat, and then the rifleman dropping soldiers in a doorway, and then the grenadier driving crews out of their tanks, and then the machine gunner, and then the man crawling to cover and escape. From the German side, the defense had no readable shape at all. Every time they thought they'd located the threat and started to answer it, the threat came from somewhere new, wearing a different weapon. You can't suppress what you can't fix in place. They were fighting a defense that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, and the only explanation that fit was numbers they didn't have the stomach to test. And underneath all of it was the calm, which is maybe the most unnerving thing of all to face. Rage you can understand. A screaming man charging a tank is frightening, but he's also making mistakes, and part of you knows he'll burn out or get himself killed. What Currey showed instead was control. Cold, deliberate, economical control, under fire that should have shattered anyone's nerve. When your enemy is that composed while you're losing men, a question starts to work on you that's worse than fear. What does he know that I don't? Why isn't he afraid? Men who traded on being the most frightening thing in any room were suddenly the ones doing the math and coming up short. And there is no propaganda, no reputation, no earned brutality that protects you from that feeling in the moment it arrives. There's a bleak kind of justice in it too. The SS built their whole method on fear. The massacre in that field days earlier was terror used as a weapon, meant to break the will of anyone in their path. And here, at this one crossing, the fear ran the other direction. The men who traded on being the thing others were afraid of ran into someone they couldn't read, couldn't predict, and couldn't stop. And they blinked. They pulled back from ground they'd already half taken because the cost of one more push had become impossible to calculate. When it was finally over, the strong point was still American. The bridge hadn't fallen. The 5 men Currey had refused to leave behind were alive. And the quiet replacement from a Catskills farm was, somehow, still standing in the cold, having done in one morning what usually takes a coordinated anti-tank team and a lot of luck. It's worth pausing on the strategic weight of that, because it's easy to hear a story like this as one brave man having a good day and miss what it actually bought. That crossing was a door. If it had swung open, German armor had a path deeper into the American position, and the threat wasn't just to Currey's platoon, but to the flank of his whole battalion. Hold the door and the battalion's line stays intact. Lose it and the collapse spreads sideways, one unit forcing the next to give ground, the way a tear runs through fabric. The Battle of the Bulge was won and lost in 1,000 small stands exactly like this one, at road junctions and river crossings that meant nothing on their own and everything together. Currey's morning was one of those stands. The official citation puts it plainly. By stemming that attack, he kept the enemy from turning his battalion's flank. Strip away the drama, and that's a genuinely important piece of ground held by, functionally, one man. There's no film of it. No embedded camera, no drone overhead, none of the ways we'd capture something like this now. What we have is the account the survivors gave and the citation the army wrote from it, and the striking thing is how little either needed to exaggerate. The plain sequence of events is already almost too much to believe. Usually the legend grows in the retelling, and the truth turns out smaller. With Currey, it's the opposite. The more precisely you lay out what actually happened, step by step, the more absurd and the more impressive it gets. The men who'd been there knew what they'd watched. Currey wasn't the type to talk it up, but you can't hide that kind of thing from the people standing next to you. Word climbed the chain. In March of 1945, his company commander formally recommended him for the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration the United States gives, citing exactly the sequence of things he'd done at that strong point. It's worth remembering how rarely that recommendation gets made, and how much rarer still it is for it to survive the scrutiny that follows. Currey's did, without any trouble, because there were witnesses to every impossible part of it. He didn't stop fighting after Malmedy, by the way. He became a squad leader and picked up a Silver Star for gallantry in a separate action at his regiment's command post. And even after the shooting in Europe had mostly stopped, the war found him one more time. He was shot in Bavaria while disarming German soldiers, which is how he earned his third Purple Heart. 3 Purple Hearts. The man was wounded and kept going back more than once. The medal itself came on the 27th of July, 1945, near Reims in France, pinned on him by Major General Leland Hobbs, who commanded the 30th Division. It was made official a few weeks later in August. Alongside the Medal of Honor, his record eventually held the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, those 3 Purple Hearts, and Belgium's Order of Leopold, the country he'd helped keep from being overrun, saying its own thank you. He came home that summer aboard the Queen Mary, a first sergeant now, a long way in every sense from the replacement who'd shipped over the year before without a winter coat. And then he did the most surprising thing of all, given what he'd been through. He went quiet and stayed useful. There were no memoirs with his name on the cover, no lecture circuit, no trading on the medal. He took a job as a counselor at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Albany, New York, and he did it for 30 years, from 1950 until he retired as a supervisor in 1980. Sit with the shape of that career. The man who'd survived the worst morning imaginable spent 3 decades in a quiet office helping other men carry what they'd survived. He knew, better than any textbook, what those veterans were dragging around, because he was dragging some of it himself. Think about what that job asked of him, and what it must have cost. Every day, men would come through that office carrying wounds you couldn't see, the kind that don't show on an X-ray, and Currey sat across from them and helped them find a way to live with what they'd brought home. He couldn't have done it by reciting from a manual. He did it because he'd been to the same country they had. He knew the particular weight of it, and he chose to spend 30 years lifting a corner of that weight off other men, quietly, on a government salary, with none of the fanfare his medal could have bought him. There's a version of a war hero who spends the rest of his life reliving the best morning of it. Currey went the other way entirely. He put the morning down and picked up the work of helping people survive theirs. After that, he started a landscaping business, because apparently sitting still wasn't in him, and later he worked booking conventions at a hotel down in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, right up until 2002. Ordinary jobs, ordinary life. If you'd sat next to him at a diner counter, he'd have been the last person to tell you what he was. He didn't bring it up. He rarely talked about that day at all, and when he did, he had a way of making it sound almost routine, like it was just the job in front of him, and he'd done it. To the world, he was a soft-spoken retiree in upstate New York. To the SS crews who'd faced him on that bridge, he'd been something a lot harder to name. The recognition kept finding him anyway, whether he wanted the spotlight or not. In 1998, he became the first Medal of Honor recipient to be turned into a G.I. Joe action figure, a real one, molded after a real man, so that kids opening a box could hold a small plastic version of someone who'd actually done the thing. There was a mural of him unveiled in Hurleyville in 2013, while he was still alive to see it, which is rare, and which matters. That same year, his photograph rode on a sheet of Medal of Honor stamps issued by the Postal Service. He was inducted into the New York State Senate's Veterans Hall of Fame. A road near where he lived carries his name. None of it seems to have gone to his head. By every account, he stayed the same modest man who'd have rather talked about your day than his own. He died on the 8th of October 2019 at the age of 94 in Selkirk, New York. He'd made it 75 years past the morning that should have killed him at 19. He got to grow old, which is a thing a lot of the men he served with never did, and there's something fitting about the fact that the man who saved 5 lives on a bridge got to keep his own for the better part of a century. I keep coming back to the gap between what the Army thought of him and what he turned out to be. They looked at an 18-year-old and decided he was too immature to lead. Then, at 19, with no orders and no time to think, he made every right call in a situation that would have paralyzed most trained officers, and he did it while standing in the open, and he did it for other men rather than himself. Whatever the officer board was measuring, it was measuring the wrong thing. So could there be another Francis Currey today? Could one soldier still tip a battle the way he tipped that one, in an age of drones and satellites and precision fire, where a single man in a doorway with a rifle feels like a relic of an older, closer kind of war? Maybe not in the same way. The battlefield he stood on doesn't really exist anymore. But the thing that made him dangerous wasn't the bazooka or the machine gun. It was the calm. It was the ability to keep thinking clearly when the smart, safe, human move is to freeze, and to keep choosing the harder right thing shot after shot after shot. That doesn't belong to 1944. That belongs to whoever has it, whenever they're tested. The SS came to Malmedy trading on fear, certain they were the thing to be afraid of. On one cold morning at one contested bridge, a 19-year-old orphan from a farm in the Catskills taught them what it felt like to be on the other end of it. He never called himself a hero. He'd have hated the word scariest. He'd have shrugged and said he just did his job. But the men who faced him knew. You don't pull 4 tank crews out of their own tanks and force an SS attack to turn around by doing your job. You do it by being, for a few unforgettable minutes, the most terrifying thing on the battlefield. And the strangest part, the part that still gets me, is that the terrifying thing was a quiet kid nobody expected anything from, who spent the rest of his long life being kind to broken men and never once bragging about the morning he held the line alone. That's Francis Sherman Currey. Too immature to be an officer at 18, the scariest soldier of the war at 19, and a good quiet man for the 75 years after. If you had to hold a bridge like that, with no orders and no help coming, do you think you'd freeze? Or do you think something would take over the way it took over him? I'd like to know where you land on that. Leave it in the comments, and thanks for watching.